visible. And we are there. So hello there, this is History of a Beer with Dips. And today we are starting with the beer. I have Viennese lager. It is, well, oh, now you can see it better. Not that there's much to see. As you see, there is no etiquette because this is the privately produced beer by my friend and Black Chamber Council member of this show. One of the men who listened to my lectures long before this show was aired first time. Is Viennese lager, and it's good. It's surprisingly good for the first beer of my friend. So today we're gonna talk about mutual understanding. Oh, the name of the thing is Phalanx still. Sorry, didn't edit it. So yes, today we're gonna talk about mutual understanding. Polish-Japanese mutual understanding, because you see, sometimes even war is, so to speak, well, not enough for people to stop what they're doing and just begin hostilities, especially when you declare war on somebody that you were previously in very good relations, and now this declaration of war is forced. So that was exactly the thing that happened between Polish and Japanese, because Polish and Japanese cooperated even before Poland was reinstated as a sovereign state after the First World War, and modern Polish-Japanese relations, you may say, started in 1905, that is during the Polish-Japanese War. Even I think before that time, Polish, back then dissident and political activist and military man Józef Piłsudski had contacts with one Japanese army man, Motojiro Akashi. While I don't know the details of this cooperation, some Polish historians are of the opinion that back then in 1905 Piłsudski was basically Motojiro's man, part of his spy network in Europe. However, after the Polish-Japanese War, during this war, some Polish sailors served with Russian Navy that get their butts kicked in the Tsushima battle, and Polish prisoners of war were treated surprisingly well by Japanese. So that was like the first sign for the major Polish public that the Japanese are kind of cool guys. Like, they could fight us, like they could fight other Polish during those battles, but they treated this Polish very well. After First World War, on the other hand, 1918, some of Polish orphans ended up in the far Russian Siberia, and Japanese, like directly after the First World War, were patrolling coasts of Siberia. They were very threatened. They felt very threatened by the Soviet Communist Revolution, and this Soviet Communist Revolution and generally Russian Empire before that were the reason Polish and Japanese had this understanding I was talking about. And let's take a break. After the First World War, a lot of Polish orphans ended up in the eastern extents of ex-Russian, now Soviet Empire, and the Japanese, first direct action in cooperation between Polish and Japanese is to bring those 700 or something like that orphans home to Poland, and Japanese were very cooperative, and there are also some heartbreaking stories of a Japanese nurse that treated a Polish boy who was very sick with cholera, I think, um, and this nurse basically didn't want this boy to die alone, so she was constantly on the side of his bed, and this boy survived. He went up to Poland. He lived to the Second World War, and later, well, I don't know what happened to this boy during or after Second World War. However, he did get 20 years at least more of life thanks to this Japanese nurse, and this Japanese nurse later died because she contracted the sickness this boy had. So this was also a story that was that became quite famous in the 20s in Poland, and was one of the reasons Polish thought sympathetically about the Japanese country and the Japanese society, and that started cultural and trade ties between freshly reinstated Poland and the Japanese Empire. However, after Polish Bolshevik War of 1919-1921, Japanese intelligence in Europe, also Motojiro Akashi was around Poland during and in this region of Europe during Polish Bolshevik War, so he could report it back to Tokyo that Polish radio decrypting services were very good against Soviet armed forces during those years, and basically this radio intelligence decrypting services of Polish General Headquarters bear a lot of responsibility for the Polish win during this war, during the Battle of Warsaw. They decrypted, they basically, well, not hijacked, but they listened to everything Soviets said, especially that some Soviets, well, didn't use their decrypting methods well. They made mistakes, and Polish exploited that very well. And Japanese heard about that, and they had their own problems with the Soviet radio network, in decrypting Soviet radio network. So they invited Polish to cooperation, and one Polish radio operator, Major, I think it was Sostkowski was his name. He spent in Japan 3 months in 1922, making the official course for Japanese servicemen. Later, this Japanese servicemen created Japanese radio decrypting agency or services in the Japanese army, and so Polish experiences were used in Japan against Soviets, and it was very very good for Japanese basically, but Polish did get their own share of information from the Japanese in exchange. So this intelligence cooperation of Poland and Japan dates back to, well, 1905. It was basically, well, only Józef Piłsudski and some Polish agents cooperating with the Japanese supervisors, but in 20 years it developed into full-time cooperation between Polish so-called Dwójka, that was the second division of the Polish army headquarters. It was military intelligence basically, and the corresponding services on the Japanese side. And so this our cooperation were so were so beneficial, and we so basically liked each other. There were also personal ties between the Polish officers and Japanese officers, and not only Japanese officers. I will tell you more about that in a minute, and and they developed outstanding relations up to the Second World War. Even when Second World War started, Japanese was supposedly German ally, not very good ally, so to say, but they were allies nevertheless. And still, the Polish embassy in Tokyo ran like nothing happened. and Germans put pressure on Japanese to to close Polish embassy in Tokyo, but the Japanese didn't do it for 2 full years. They closed Polish Japanese in Tokyo in October 1941. That is 25 months, full 25 months after Germany invasion on Poland started. And during that time, between 1939 and the beginning of the Second World War and 1941, Polish and Japanese cooperated. You may heard about the Japanese consul from Kovno in Lithuania, Chuichi Sugihara. He is just among nations of the world. He helped the Jews very much. He issued like few thousands visas for Jews to escape Poland and Lithuania, and some of them ended in Japan, or some of them ended in Great Britain or United States later. Basically, they escaped the Holocaust and the persecutions thanks to Sugihara. And Sugihara was cooperating with one Polish super spy who was the main coordinator during the beginning of the war up to 1944. Polish first major, then colonel Michał Rybikowski. He was a Polish super spy. He was coordinating efforts of gathering intelligence, gathering data in Eastern Europe, and he also gathered data from Germany. He was based in Riga. He was cooperating with Japanese consul and embassy in the Baltic states. They had a very good relation. As I told. Later, from 1941, I think, to 1944, he was cooperating with the Japanese general Onedoro Makoto, I think, or Makoto, the later one, and the Japanese knew about him. Japanese also in their diplomatic mission staff in Europe, in Germany, had other Polish intelligence operators, and they knew it. There were like at least 6 personal ties you can point in between Polish intelligence officers, both men and women, and the Japanese military attaches or diplomats, or military men working in Europe in conjunction with Germans. And Germans also knew that. Germans knew that the Japanese are cooperating with Polish intelligence officers, and in that atmosphere, in December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, which put all of that Polish-Japanese relations in jeopardy, because in 1941 December 11th, few days after Pearl Harbor, Allies as a group declared war on Japan. So Great Britain declared war, the Czech Republic declared war, Norway government in UK declared war, and Poland as well declared war on Japan. All of these declarations of war were accepted by the Japanese except one, and Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo declared that we do not, and that is as much a quote as I can translate it from Polish myself. We do not accept Polish challenge, since we recognize that Polish fighting for their own freedom were forced to this declaration of war by United Kingdom, by the Great Britain. And Hideki Tojo was obviously very much aware about Polish-Japanese cooperation. He realized that Japan itself and especially radio decrypting services of Japanese Empire had a lot to thank to their Polish counterparts, and he didn't want this cooperation go to waste, so it didn't. Poland, basically only for prestigious reasons, had a handful of people on the Pacific actually fighting Japanese, and that was like 65 65 Polish officers that were serving with two British divisions in Burma, today's Myanmar country, between India and Thailand. So that was 65 Polish there, 65 exactly. There was two ships, but civilian ships, serving as troop transport that cooperated with on the Pacific with the Allied forces against Japanese. And there were exactly one Polish fighter pilot that volunteered to the U.S. Flying Services, to the U.S. Air Force, and he served with the Flying Tigers division, also in Burma and in China. Supposedly, his name was Witold Urbanowicz. He is actually a Polish fighting ace. He fought in the Battle of Britain in 303 squadrons. He scored a lot of victories there. He fought Germans over Poland from the first day of war, and later from 1944 to 45 he downed 11 reportedly among, according to American historian Koshkodian, he downed 11 Japanese aircraft over China. So that is basically all. So 66 people plus crews of two cargo transports were the all Polish citizens basically taking arms against Japanese. And in the same time, up to the at least 1944, Polish, and I think right to the end of the war, Polish intelligence operators gathered informations about Germany, cooperating with the Onedaro Makato and Consul Sugihara in Europe. A lot of them had, Japanese passports. A lot of them basically were Japanese residents. They received Japanese citizenship, even, and were protected. One of Polish super spies, as I mentioned, Michał Rypikowski, one time he took out from his post in Stockholm, he transported some intelligence material to Berlin, to Japanese mission in Berlin, and later, Gestapo was tailing him. So he hid himself in a Japanese embassy in Berlin. He was hidden in a safe. Like, there are still these big wall safes, like basically armored. So he was put in there. Gestapo searched entire Japanese embassy. They didn't found him, and he was then later taken out of this safe he was hidden in, and he was basically unconscious and close to death from lack of oxygen. Without regaining consciousness, he was put into the plane and sent back to Stockholm, in Sweden, in the neutral Sweden. So he basically got out like that close to the German Gestapo. And even after like a Polish declaration of war, this cooperation was very good. So you may ask question like, why Japanese threatened their relations with Germans? Well, first they had a lot to thank for, but it's not that. They still received a lot of information about Germany from Polish operators, and a lot of information about Soviet Union from Polish operators, so they were very happy with that. And the fact that the Japanese knew the Polish intelligence gathered information about the state of the German armed forces and so on. Some of the information from the allies from the Great British also trickled back to Japan that way. By the way, Americans were very knew this information that the Japanese took from Polish services and sent home. The Americans were aware, thanks to their own gathering information services, about this information Polish sent. I don't know if they were aware that Polish and Japanese cooperated to that extent. I would guess that yes, they were, but if they didn't, well, only props for Japanese and Polish intelligence services that they kept it hidden, at least from the allies. um, and you know, Polish got back from Japanese informations about Soviet Union, especially about Polish citizens that ended up in the eastern extents of Soviet Empire in gulags, that escaped and maybe, yeah, like, you know, crossed to Manchuria. They did get Polish passports, and they basically helped by the Japanese. So yes, this is 20. So we just broke 20 minutes. So it will be all for today, and that was a brief story of Polish and Japanese intelligence cooperation, even during war. Like if we have mutual understanding, even war cannot, you know, get between that and our you know, our common interest. Our mutual understanding is stronger than any war forced upon us can be. So I think it is quite optimistic, isn't it? And this beer, how do we rate it? I think well, it's first beer, and it's first beer. I think it's 3. It's 3 out of 5. It's very promising, Shank. Very promising. Good job. And next time we pick up another Polish super spy. But in this show we talked a little bit about Polish male super spy Michał Rybikowski. Next show will be entirely about one person and her affairs, because it was a gal super spy, Krystyna Skarbek. You can Google her if you want, because she is like a James Bond. Like, she could, if Michał Rybikowski was Polish super spy, then Kristyn Glenville or Krystyna Skarbek was basically James Bond in skirt. Like, she was awesome. And well, thank you, Paweł. Glad you was able to catch me as well. And well, hope you will be here also next time. So it's all for today. Take care, folks. Good luck.